Sometimes I still can't believe you're here, Rebecca said, sorting through appointment files. Working with me, helping these kids. After everything I did. Maybe that's exactly why I'm here, Sandra replied, checking their schedule on her laptop. She was fully comfortable with technology now. Think about it. I could have aged normally in that coma, or not woken up at all. Instead, I got to keep my youth, my energy, my ability to connect with these kids. Maybe the universe has a plan after all. Through the window, they could see their last group therapy session of the day ending. Teenagers streamed out of the building, some laughing, some deep in thought, all carrying a little less weight than when they'd arrived. You know what's funny? Sandra mused. Back then, all I wanted was to be prom queen. To be perfect. Now I know that our imperfections, our mistakes, our darkest moments, they're what make us able to help others. Rebecca smiled, touching the framed news article about their partnership. The headline read, Sleeping Beauty and the Dragon, Former Rivals Unite to Help Troubled Youth. We should really get them to change that headline, Sandra laughed. I was never a sleeping beauty, and you were never a dragon. We were just two girls who needed what we're giving these kids now, understanding, forgiveness, and a chance to rewrite our story. As they locked up for the night, a text came through on Sandra's phone. It was from Amy, sending a TikTok video of their assembly that had already gone viral. You're trending, Aunt Sandy. Hashtag Sleeping Queen Speaks, hashtag Second Chances. Sandra showed it to Rebecca, both of them marveling at how their story was reaching people they'd never meet. In the comments, teenagers shared their own struggles with jealousy, pressure, and the need for redemption. Look at all these kids, Rebecca said softly. Maybe those 30 years weren't lost after all. Maybe they were just waiting for the right moment when both of us could do the most good. They walked to their cars, parked side by side now, a far cry from that fatal prom night. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, just like it had 30 years ago. But this time, there was no anger, no fear, no jealousy. Just two women who had learned that sometimes the longest way home is the one that helps others find their way too. Same time tomorrow? Sandra asked, keys in hand. Same time tomorrow, Rebecca nodded. We've got a lot more stories to change. As they drove away in opposite directions, their headlights cutting through the growing dark, both women smiled. Sometimes the best endings aren't about forgetting the past, but about using it to light the way forward. And sometimes the deepest sleep leads to the most beautiful awakening. 1 year after their reunion, Sandra stood backstage at Riverside High's auditorium, her heart beating as fast as it had on prom night. But this time, Rebecca stood beside her, both of them waiting to share their story with a new generation of students. The old gym had been renovated, but Sandra could still see the ghost of streamers and disco balls when she closed her eyes. Now, hundreds of students filled the seats, their faces lit by phone screens instead of dance lights. Principal Chen, Danny's son, stepped up to the microphone. Today's assembly is different, he began. We have two speakers who know our school's history better than anyone. Some of you might have heard the story of the sleeping prom queen. Today, you'll hear the truth from both sides. Sandra walked onto the stage first, her appearance causing a ripple of whispers. She knew what they saw, someone who looked just a few years older than them, wearing modern clothes, but carrying 3 decades of history in her eyes. 30 years ago, I stood on this stage to accept a crown, she began, her voice steady. I was 18, just like many of you. I had dreams, plans, and what I thought was a perfect life. But perfection can be dangerous, both for the person trying to be perfect and for those living in their shadow. Rebecca joined her on stage, her gray hair and lined face a stark contrast to Sandra's youth. More whispers, as students recognized the famous therapist who'd been in the news lately. I was that shadow, Rebecca said into the microphone. I was the girl who let jealousy eat away at her soul until one terrible choice changed 2 lives forever. Today, we're here to tell you about consequences, forgiveness, and what happens after the worst mistake of your life. Together, they shared their story. Not the newspaper version, not the local legend, but the raw truth. They talked about the pressure to be perfect, the pain of feeling invisible, the poison of unchecked jealousy. Rebecca described her years of running from guilt, while Sandra spoke about waking up to find the world had moved on without her. But here's the thing about time, Sandra said, looking out at the sea of young faces. It's precious. Every single moment. I lost 30 years in what felt like a blink. Some of you might feel like high school is taking forever, but trust me, life moves faster than you think. A girl in the front row raised her hand. Aren't you angry? How can you stand there with the person who took all those years from you? Sandra and Rebecca exchanged a look. Anger is like a car without brakes, Rebecca answered. Once it starts moving, you can't control where it takes you. I learned that the hard way. And holding on to anger, Sandra added, is like putting yourself in a coma while the world moves on. I had 30 years of sleep. I don't want to waste any more time being angry. They showed slides of their work together at New Horizons, which had opened a new branch in Riverside. Pictures of teens finding their voice through art therapy, group sessions where kids learned to face their shadows instead of being consumed by them. Every day at our center, Rebecca explained, we see young people struggling with the same feelings we had. The need to be perfect, the fear of being overlooked, the anger that feels like it'll never end. But we also see them heal, grow, and learn from our mistakes instead of repeating them. Sandra stepped forward. Look around this gym, really look. That person you're jealous of. They're probably fighting battles you can't see. That person you think has it all? They might be drowning in the pressure to keep it all together. We're all human, all imperfect, all worthy of second chances. After the assembly, students lined up to talk to them. Some shared their own stories of rivalry and resentment. Others asked about the center's programs. One girl hugged Sandra, crying as she confessed to thoughts of hurting someone who'd hurt her. Come see us tomorrow, Sandra told her softly. We'll help you find a better way. Later that evening, Sandra and Rebecca sat in their shared office at New Horizons Riverside. The walls were covered with a mixture of old and new. Sandra's restored prom queen tiara in a case next to thank you letters from teens they'd helped. A photo of them both at the center's opening, alongside Sandra's original prom picture. Show me, Sandra said suddenly. Show me what you do here. How you help them. Rebecca blinked in surprise. You want to see my work? I woke up to find I'm still young while everyone else grew up. Maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe I'm supposed to help too. For the next hour, Rebecca showed Sandra around the center. She introduced her to the staff, showed her the art therapy room, the group counseling spaces. Sandra watched as Rebecca talked with a teenage girl who reminded her so much of their younger selves. Sometimes, Rebecca told the girl, the person you're really angry at is yourself. And sometimes, forgiveness is something you have to learn to give yourself first. Sandra caught Rebecca's eye across the room, seeing decades of guilt and redemption in that look. The anger she'd carried across time began to feel lighter, less important than the lives being changed in this building. I missed 30 years, Sandra said later, as they sat in Rebecca's office again. But you lost those years too, didn't you? Living with what you did. Rebecca nodded, unable to speak. I can't get those years back, Sandra continued. But maybe we can do something good with the time we have now. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe it's time for both of us to wake up. Me from my coma, you from your guilt. Maybe we can help these kids together, show them what happens on both sides of anger. Rebecca stared at her in disbelief. You'd want to work with me? After everything? I'm 18, remember? Sandra smiled slightly. Too young to waste time on hatred. Besides, look at all the good that's come from your guilt. Imagine what we could do with forgiveness instead. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows across the office floor, two women who had been frozen in a moment 30 years ago finally began to thaw. There would be more conversations, more tears, more healing needed. But something had shifted, like the first crack in winter ice, a promise of spring, of new beginnings, of life after the longest sleep. The California sun felt different from what Sandra remembered back home. She stood outside a modern office building, its glass walls reflecting the cloudless sky. The sign read New Horizons Teen Counseling Center, and somewhere inside, Rebecca Torres was about to start her workday. Sandra had told her family she was visiting Jenny's college friend in California. Only Emmy knew the truth, having helped her aunt track down Rebecca's work address. Just be careful, Emmy had texted that morning. And remember, you can video call me anytime. The reception area was cool and calm, with motivational posters on the walls and a small fountain bubbling in the corner. The receptionist smiled up at Sandra. Do you have an appointment? No, Sandra said, her heart pounding. But could you tell Dr. Torres that Sandra Mitchell is here? From Riverside High. The receptionist's smile froze slightly. Clearly, she recognized the name. Everyone in Riverside knew the story of the sleeping prom queen. Word had spread when Sandra woke up, making national news for a few days before the world moved on to its next sensation. One moment, please. Sandra sat in a comfortable chair, watching teenagers and parents come and go. The walls were covered with thank you cards and artwork from Rebecca's patients. One drawing caught her eye. A bridge spanning a deep canyon, with words written across it. It's never too late to cross over. 5 minutes passed. 10. Sandra was about to leave when a door opened. Rebecca stood there, her hair more gray than dark now, wearing a professional blazer and holding a coffee mug that slipped from her fingers when she saw Sandra. The crash of ceramic on tile made everyone jump. Coffee spread across the floor like a dark stain, much like the ones that never came out of Sandra's prom dress. It's really you, Rebecca whispered. Her face had aged, lined with years of worry, but her eyes were the same. I heard you woke up, Put. Can we talk? Sandra asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Rebecca nodded, leading her into a private office. Awards and degrees covered the walls, along with more artwork from teens. Rebecca closed the door, her hands shaking as she gestured to a chair. I've practiced this moment in my head for 30 years, Rebecca said, sitting behind her desk. What I would say if you ever woke up, but now? Now it's real, Sandra finished. She looked around the office at the life Rebecca had built. You help kids now. I try to stop them from making the mistakes I made. Rebecca's voice cracked. I help them deal with jealousy, anger, the darkness that can grow inside until it explodes. She pulled open a drawer, taking out an old newspaper clipping, Sandra's prom photo. I keep this to remind me. Every day, I look at it and remember what happens when you let hatred win. Sandra leaned forward. Tell me about that night. I need to hear it from you. Tears rolled down Rebecca's cheeks as she spoke. She described the jealousy that had consumed her, the stolen champagne, the moment of blind rage when she saw Sandra in the parking lot. I didn't mean to hit you, she whispered. I just wanted to scare you. But then you turned around, and it was too late, and I ran. Like a coward, I ran. You left me there, Sandra said quietly. For 30 years you left me there. I know. Rebecca's shoulders shook. I destroyed both our lives that night. You lost 30 years and I've spent every day since then trying to make up for it. Working with kids who remind me of myself at that age, trying to help them choose a better path. Sandra stood up, walking to the window. Outside, life went on. People walking, cars passing, the world spinning just like it had while she slept. You know what's strange? She said. I'm still 18 in here. She tapped her chest. I haven't had 30 years to process this, to learn to forgive. For me, prom night was just a few months ago. Rebecca nodded. I understand if you want to press charges. I've been waiting for the police to show up ever since I heard you woke up. Is that what you think I came for? Sandra turned back to face her. To punish you? Didn't you? Sandra sat back down, really looking at the woman who had changed both their lives with one moment of anger. I came to understand. All these teenagers you help, you see yourself in them, don't you? The angry girl from prom night? Every single one, Rebecca admitted. Especially the ones who think they're alone, who feel overshadowed or forgotten. I tell them my story, not all of it, but enough. I tell them how one moment of anger can echo through decades. Her phone buzzed. She had one now, though she was still getting used to it. It was Emmy sending her something called a TikTok video. Sandra smiled, remembering how she used to teach Jenny to do cartwheels. Now her niece was teaching her about a whole new world. That night, unable to sleep, Sandra opened her laptop, another new thing to learn, and typed Rebecca Torres into Google. Pages of results appeared. Rebecca was a successful therapist in California, specializing in helping troubled teenagers. Her professional photo showed a woman with gray-streaked hair and kind eyes, nothing like the angry girl from prom night. Sandra clicked through news articles about Rebecca's work with at-risk youth, her speeches about second chances and redemption. There was no mention of Riverside or prom night or hit and runs, but in every photo, Rebecca wore long sleeves, even in summer shots. Sandra wondered if she was hiding the same small scar she remembered seeing on Rebecca's arm in chemistry class. Looking her up won't help, Jenny said from the doorway, making Sandra jump. Trust me, I spent years doing the same thing. Did you ever? Sandra started. Contact her? No, Mom and Dad wanted to, back when they were still angry. But what would it change? We focused on you, on keeping you alive, on believing you'd wake up someday. Jenny sat on the bed beside her sister. And you did. That's the miracle we got. Sandra closed the laptop, but the image of Rebecca's professional smile stayed in her mind. I missed so much of your life, she said suddenly, tears spilling. Your graduation, your wedding, your kids being born. Jenny pulled her into a hug. But you're here now. And my kids need a cool aunt to teach them all the stuff I won't let them do. They laughed together, and for a moment, Sandra felt like no time had passed at all. But then her phone buzzed with another notification, and reality settled back in. She was a teenager trapped in a middle-aged world, trying to learn how to live all over again. One day at a time, her physical therapist had said. So that's what Sandra did. She learned to use self-checkout machines at stores, figured out how to stream music, and slowly got used to seeing her young face among her aged peers. But at night, she still dreamed of headlights in a dark parking lot and wondered if Rebecca did too. The physical therapy room at Riverside General became Sandra's new classroom. While her body remembered how to walk faster than the doctors expected, her mind struggled to catch up with 30 years of change. Her niece Emmy sat with her during these sessions, helping her navigate the strange new world she'd awakened to. So everyone just shares their whole life online? Sandra asked, scrolling through what Emmy called an Instagram feed on a smartphone. Her thumb still felt clumsy on the glass screen, but she was learning. Not their whole life, Emmy explained, showing her how to like a photo. Just the parts they want people to see. Like nobody posts about failing a test or fighting with their friends. Sandra frowned. That seems fake. In my time, you had to deal with things face to face. She paused, remembering passing notes in class, gossiping by lockers. Well, mostly face to face. The physical therapist had Sandra walk across the room again, monitoring her progress. Her muscles were surprisingly strong for someone who'd been in a coma, another mystery the doctors couldn't explain. But everything felt different. The floor materials, the clothes she wore, even the air seemed to smell different. At home, her parents' house, now modified with ramps for her mother's walker. Sandra spent hours in her old bedroom. Jenny had kept it exactly as it was, down to the boy band posters on the walls and the stack of college acceptance letters on the desk. But the world outside her window was unrecognizable. Want to try ordering lunch? Her nephew Tom asked one afternoon, pulling out his phone. You can get pretty much any food delivered now. Sandra watched in amazement as he pulled up an app showing dozens of restaurants. But how do they know where to bring it? GPS, Tom said, then saw her confused face. Like digital maps that know exactly where you are. Here, let me show you. Every day brought new discoveries. Some were exciting. Video calling with Jenny's family across the country, watching any movie instantly without going to a video store, having whole libraries of music in a tiny device. Others were overwhelming. The constant notifications, the pressure to respond instantly to messages, the way everyone seemed attached to their phones. The hardest part wasn't learning the technology, though. It was seeing how people had moved on without her. Her best friends were now middle-aged mothers with teenagers of their own. Her high school boyfriend Danny had married, divorced, and married again. Even the teachers she'd known were either retired or gone. One evening, Sandra found her mother in the kitchen, cooking from an old recipe book. The familiar smell of chocolate chip cookies made time feel a little less stretched. Mom, Sandra said, watching her mother measure flour with shaky hands, what happened after that night? Linda put down the measuring cup, wiping her hands on her apron. The police investigated, but they never found who did it. Rebecca disappeared right after. Some people suspected, but she trailed off, looking out the window. Did you know? Sandra asked quietly. Did you know it was her? We all had our suspicions, but by the time anyone started asking questions, she was gone. And then, well, time just kept passing. Linda turned to face her daughter. You know what's strange? Your father and I aged 30 years, but you're different. Not just your looks. You still have that spark, that hope in your eyes. We all got tired, sweetheart. Tired of being angry, tired of waiting. Sandra helped her mother scoop cookie dough onto baking sheets, thinking about time and forgiveness. The world had changed so much, but some things, like the warmth of a kitchen and the smell of baking cookies, stayed the same. Her father cleared his throat. There's a lot that's different now, sweetheart. The world has changed quite a bit while you were sleeping. Sandra looked down at her hands, still young, still smooth, while everyone around her had aged. Tell me, she said. Tell me everything I missed. Her niece pulled out her phone, starting to show Sandra how it worked. Sandra stared in amazement as the girl's fingers flew across the glass surface, pulling up pictures, videos, and something called TikTok. This is like Star Trek, Sandra whispered, making her family laugh. Wait till you see the cars, her nephew grinned. Some of them drive themselves now. As her family caught her up on 3 decades of history, technology, and change, Sandra felt like she was dreaming again. But the warmth of their hands, the sound of their laughter, and even the confusion and fear she felt, it was all too real to be a dream. A thought struck her suddenly. Rebecca, she said. Rebecca Torres. What happened to her? The room grew quiet again. Her mother squeezed her hand. That's a story for another day, sweetheart. Right now, let's focus on getting you strong again. Sandra nodded, but her mind was already racing. She remembered headlights, remembered turning around too late, remembered Rebecca's car in the parking lot. 30 years was a long time to hold on to anger, but 30 years of sleep was a long time too. As the sun set outside her window, Sandra watched her family talk and laugh around her bed. They were strangers and yet completely familiar, aged but unchanged in all the ways that mattered. She had missed so much. Jenny's wedding, her niece and nephew's births, 3 decades of family dinners and holidays and ordinary moments. But she was awake now. And somehow, she knew this was just the beginning of her story. It started with a twitch of her fingers on a quiet Tuesday morning. The nurse almost missed it while checking Sandra's vital signs, just a tiny movement, like someone reaching for something in a dream. But then her eyelids fluttered, and the peaceful stillness of room 302 erupted into action. The first thing Sandra noticed was the ceiling, different from what she remembered, with modern LED lights instead of the old fluorescent panels. Her throat felt dry, and when she tried to speak, only a whisper came out. The nurse pressed a button, and suddenly the room filled with doctors and more nurses, their voices overlapping in excited chatter. Where? Sandra managed to croak, her voice rusty from decades of silence. A kind-faced nurse helped her sip water through a straw. The cup was different, made of some material she didn't recognize, not the plastic she remembered from hospitals. You're in Riverside General Hospital, the doctor said gently. You've been asleep for a while. Sandra tried to sit up, but her body felt heavy, unfamiliar. Her hair fell forward, dark and long, not the honey blonde she remembered. The nurse adjusted the bed, raising her to a sitting position, and Sandra caught her reflection in the window. She stared at the face looking back at her, older, but somehow not as old as it should be. Something was wrong. The prom, she said suddenly, memories flooding back. I was just at prom. Where's my dress? Where's Danny? The doctor and nurses exchanged glances. Let's call your family first, the doctor said softly. They've been waiting a very long time for this moment. Within an hour, the hospital room door burst open. An elderly woman rushed in, supported by a walker, with a gray-haired man right behind her. Sandra stared at them in confusion until the woman spoke. Sandra, baby? The voice, her mother's voice, but different, aged, broke through her confusion. Mom? Sandra whispered, her eyes widening. Dad? She looked from one aged face to another, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. These couldn't be her parents. Her parents were in their 40s, not their 70s. How long? She asked, her voice shaking. Her father took her hand, his skin papery and spotted with age. 30 years, sweetheart. You've been asleep for 30 years. The room spun. Sandra closed her eyes, opened them again, hoping the world would make sense. But everything was wrong. The machines around her bed looked like something from a sci-fi movie. There was a thin black rectangle on the wall that looked like a TV but couldn't be, and her parents looked like grandparents. A woman walked in, someone Sandra didn't recognize at first. But then she smiled, and Sandra saw her little sister Jenny in that smile, though the face belonged to a middle-aged woman. "Jenny." Sandra's voice cracked. "Little Jenny." Jenny rushed to the bed, wrapping her arms around her big sister. "Not so little anymore," she said through tears. "Oh, Standy, we've missed you so much." Sandra touched Jenny's face, trying to match this grown woman with the freshman she remembered. "You're older than I am now," she said wonderingly. "Technically," Jenny laughed through her tears, "but you've somehow kept your youthful glow. The doctors can't explain it." A teenage boy and girl peeked around the doorframe, looking nervous. Jenny waved them in. "These are my kids, your niece and nephew. They've been visiting you their whole lives." Sandra stared at the teenagers, who looked about the same age she remembered being. They were dressed so strangely, the girl in high-waisted jeans that looked like something from Sandra's mother's old photos, the boy in a hoodie with words and symbols Sandra didn't understand. The girl held up a small rectangular device, pointing it at the family. "Can I take a picture for social media? Everyone's going to freak out that Aunt Sandy's awake." "What's social media?" Sandra asked. The room fell silent. Her family exchanged looks. How do you explain 30 years of technological and cultural change to someone who just woke up? The world changed dramatically outside Sandra's window. The Twin Towers fell and rose again. Presidents came and went. Phones became smart, cars started driving themselves, and social media transformed how people connected. But in room 302, time stood still. The only changes were the rotating flowers in the vase and the growing collection of cards and photos on the walls. Jenny's kids, Sandra's niece and nephew, would visit their sleeping Aunt Sandy. They'd tell her about their days at school, about their dreams and fears. They didn't know her as the prom queen or the straighter student. To them, she was just their mom's big sister who needed to wake up and try their grandma's new cookie recipe. Linda kept hoping, even as her hair turned completely white and her visits required a walker. Tom never missed an evening, though now he read the news from a tablet instead of a newspaper. They refused to give up, even when well-meaning doctors suggested it might be time to consider other options. "She's still in there," Linda would insist. "A mother knows these things." And somehow, through all those years, Sandra's hand stayed warm, her heart kept beating steadily, and her face remained peaceful, as if she was just waiting for the right moment to open her eyes and ask what she had missed. The steady beeping of hospital machines became the soundtrack to the Mitchell family's life. Room 302 of Riverside General Hospital turned into their second home, with its mint-green walls and the constant smell of disinfectant. Sandra lay there, looking like she was just taking a peaceful nap, while the world outside her window changed season by season. Her mother, Linda, would come every morning with fresh flowers. She'd replace the old ones, adjust Sandra's pillows, and brush her daughter's hair, which had grown long and dark without the sun to keep its honey highlights. She'd talk about everything and nothing, hoping her voice might be the one thing that finally brought her daughter back. "You should see your sister Jenny now," she'd say, arranging daisies in a vase. "She's starting high school next week. She wants to try out for cheerleading just like you." Linda's voice would crack a little, but she'd keep talking. The doctors said familiar voices might help. Sandra's father, Tom, would come in the evenings after work. He'd sit in the warm leather chair by the bed, reading the newspaper out loud. "The internet is becoming huge now," he'd tell her. "Everyone's getting computers at home. You'd love it. You can talk to people all over the world instantly." The nurses grew to know the Mitchells well. They watched as Linda's brown hair turned gray, as Tom's strong shoulders began to stoop. They watched as Jenny grew from a wide-eyed freshman into a confident young woman who'd visit her sister between college classes. Meanwhile, Rebecca Torres had fled across the country. She landed in a small town where nobody knew her name or her story. But the guilt followed her like a shadow. She'd wake up in cold sweats, the sound of tires on asphalt playing in her dreams. She couldn't look at teenage girls without seeing Sandra's face. Back in the hospital, the world kept spinning. The TV in Sandra's room showed the rise and fall of boy bands, the dawn of reality shows, the birth of social media. Her friends would visit when they could, though their visits grew less frequent as life pulled them in different directions. They'd bring their wedding photos, then pictures of their babies, then stories of their kids starting school. Jenny got married in the hospital chapel so Sandra could be there, even if only in body. They wheeled her bed down to watch her sister say I do. The bride wore their mother's pearl necklace, the same one Sandra had worn to prom. There wasn't a dry eye in the room when Jenny kissed her sister's forehead before walking down the aisle. The doctors kept monitoring, kept running tests. The brain is mysterious, they'd say. We can't predict when or if she'll wake up. But they couldn't explain why her body didn't age like most coma patients. Her muscles didn't waste away as expected. It was as if time was touching her more gently than it should. Technology in the hospital room updated around her. The bulky monitors became sleeker, the machines more sophisticated. Nurses started carrying tablets instead of clipboards. Sandra's old CD player, which had played her favorite songs, was replaced by an iPod, then by streaming music from phones. Rebecca, meanwhile, went back to school. She studied psychology, specializing in trauma and guilt. Her professors praised her insight into the human mind, never knowing it came from such a dark place. She started counseling troubled teens, trying to stop them from making the kinds of mistakes that could haunt them for decades. Sometimes she'd look up Riverside Hospital online, searching for any news. She'd find herself staring at Sandra's yearbook photo, which local news websites would use whenever they did stories about the sleeping prom queen. A local legend that parents used to warn their kids about drinking and driving. The engine started quietly at first. Sandra was looking up at the real stars, thinking how they were even prettier than the decorations inside. The car's headlights stayed off as it rolled forward, picking up speed. Sandra turned at the sound of tires on asphalt, but it was too late. The impact wasn't loud, nothing like in the movies. Just a dull thud, the sound of breaking glass as the Tiara hit the ground, and then silence. Rebecca's car disappeared into the night, leaving only tire marks and broken dreams behind. Inside the gym, the party continued. The music played, people danced. Unaware that their queen was lying on the cold asphalt, her perfect night shattered like the crystal tiara scattered around her. It would be 15 minutes before anyone found her, 15 minutes that would stretch into 30 years. The stars kept twinkling overhead, indifferent to the tragedy below. And somewhere in the night, Rebecca drove, her tears mixing with mascara, the empty champagne bottle rolling around on her passenger seat, not yet understanding that this moment would define both their lives for decades to come. The gym sparkled like a fairy tale come to life on prom night. Silver and blue streamers twisted from the ceiling, catching light from the disco ball that sent stars dancing across the walls. The theme, A Night Under the Stars, had transformed the usually plain gymnasium into something magical. Everyone looked different tonight. Boys in sleek tuxedos instead of Letterman jackets, girls in flowing dresses instead of school uniforms. Sandra stood near the punch bowl, her pale blue dress catching the light perfectly. She hadn't wanted anything too flashy, just simple elegance, like the pearl necklace her grandmother had given her for graduation. Her date, the captain of the swimming team, had gone to get them snacks, leaving her to take in the scene around her. Outside in the parking lot, Rebecca sat in her car, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her dark purple dress had cost 3 months of weekend job savings. An unopened bottle of champagne, stolen from her parents' wine cabinet, sat in the passenger seat. Her hands shook slightly as she unscrewed the cap. She hadn't planned to drink tonight, but watching couple after couple stream into the gym had changed her mind. Inside, the music switched to a slower song. Sandra watched her classmates pair up, swaying to the gentle rhythm. These were the moments she wanted to remember, not just the crown she knew was coming, but the real stuff. Like how her best friend had tripped over her heels earlier and laughed until she cried, or how the usually shy kid from her math class was now confidently leading his date in a dance. "All right, everyone." The principal's voice boomed over the speakers. "It's time to announce this year's prom king and queen." The crowd gathered around the stage, a sea of excited faces and whispered predictions. Sandra felt hands gently pushing her forward. She didn't need the encouragement. She was already moving toward the stage, her heart beating in time with the drum roll that had started playing. This year's prom king is... The principal paused for dramatic effect. Danny Chen. The swimming captain jogged up to the stage, accepting his plastic crown with a goofy bow that made everyone laugh. Sandra caught his eye and smiled. They'd been friends since middle school, and she was genuinely happy for him. Rebecca watched through the gym's windows, the champagne bottle now half empty. She saw Sandra's perfect smile, her perfect walk, her perfect everything. The lights from inside the gym blurred slightly as she took another swig. "And you're prom queen for the class of 1994. Another dramatic pause. "Sandra Mitchell." The crowd erupted in cheers. Sandra walked up to the stage, trying to take in every detail. The way the spotlight felt warm on her skin, the sound of her heels on the wooden steps, the weight of the crystal tiara as the principal placed it on her head. She wanted to remember it all. Would our king and queen like to share a dance? The DJ asked, dimming the lights as a new song started. Sandra and Danny moved to the center of the dance floor. Other couples joined them, and soon the floor was full again. But something felt off to Sandra. The gym was getting stuffy, the lights too bright, the music too loud. "I need some air," she whispered to Danny. "Save me another dance." He nodded, already being pulled away by his friends who wanted to congratulate him. Sandra slipped through the crowd, carefully touching her tiara to make sure it was secure. The cool night air felt amazing as she stepped outside. The parking lot was quiet, most cars empty now that everyone was inside. Sandra walked a few steps, letting the spring breeze cool her flushed cheeks. She didn't see Rebecca's car, hidden in the shadows of the oak trees that lined the lot. Didn't see Rebecca's hands gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white, mind clouded by champagne and years of jealousy. The sun had set completely now, leaving the parking lot in shadows. Rebecca sat in her car, watching as other students drove away, watching as the lights in the gym finally went out. She watched as Sandra walked to her own car, still wearing her practice clothes, her gym bag slung over her shoulder. Even after hours of practice, she somehow looked fresh and energetic. Just a few more weeks, Rebecca whispered to herself, starting her car. Just a few more weeks, and everything will change. She didn't know yet how right she was, or how much she would come to regret those words in the decades to come. The hallways of Riverside High buzzed with excitement on a crisp autumn morning in 1994. The sweet smell of hairspray mixed with bubble gum floated through the air as Sandra Mitchell strutted down the corridor, her white sneakers squeaking against the freshly waxed floor. Her honey blonde hair bounced with each step, held perfectly in place by enough hairspray to make any environmentalist cringe. "Hey, Sandra!" Voices called out from every direction. She waved back with her signature smile, the one that had graced every yearbook since freshman year. Her backpack, covered in doodles from her friends, hung loosely over one shoulder, packed with straight-A assignments and college application drafts. Being the queen bee of Riverside wasn't just about looks or popularity for Sandra. She worked hard for everything she had. Late nights studying while other kids partied, early morning cheerleading practices when everyone else was hitting snooze, and countless hours organizing school events that most students just showed up to enjoy. But there was one person who saw through Sandra's sparkly exterior, Rebecca Torres. She watched from her locker as Sandra charmed yet another teacher with her perfectly rehearsed laugh. Rebecca clutched her student body president folder tighter, her knuckles turning white. She had fought tooth and nail for her position, campaigning until her voice gave out, creating detailed plans for school improvement. Yet somehow, Sandra still managed to steal the spotlight without even trying. "Did you guys see Sandra's chemistry test score?" whispered a junior to her friends as they passed Rebecca. Perfect score again, and she didn't even study for it. Rebecca slammed her locker shut, causing a few freshmen to jump. What they didn't know was that Sandra had studied. Rebecca had seen her through the library windows, staying late after cheerleading practice, textbooks spread across an entire table. But somehow, Sandra made everything look effortless, while Rebecca's achievements always seemed to come with visible struggle. The upcoming prom queen election was the final straw. Sandra hadn't even campaigned, yet posters supporting her candidacy covered the halls, drawn by admiring underclassmen, hung by loyal friends. Rebecca's carefully designed campaign posters for student body initiatives barely got a second glance. During lunch, Sandra sat at her usual table, surrounded by a mix of cheerleaders, football players, and honor students. What drove Rebecca crazy wasn't that Sandra was exclusive, it was quite the opposite. Sandra would invite the shy new kid to join her table, help struggling students with their homework, and remember everyone's birthday. Her kindness felt like another perfect feature that Rebecca couldn't compete with. "Hey, Rebecca." Sandra's voice cut through Rebecca's thoughts. "I loved your speech in assembly today about increasing funding for the science lab. Maybe we could work together on the proposal." That was the worst part. Sandra Mitchell was actually nice. She wasn't the stuck-up prom queen stereotype you could easily hate. She noticed people's efforts, celebrated their successes, and genuinely tried to help. It made Rebecca's growing resentment feel even more shameful. As the day wound down, Rebecca watched Sandra lead cheerleading practice through the gym windows. Every move was precise, every smile genuine as she patiently helped younger cheerleaders master difficult routines. The setting sun cast long shadows across the gym floor, and for a moment, Rebecca saw their shadows overlap. The cheerleader and the student body president, not so different in their dedication to their passions. But then Sandra landed a perfect flip, and the squad erupted in cheers. Rebecca turned away, her stomach churning with a mix of admiration and hatred that had been brewing for years. The prom was just weeks away, and everyone knew Sandra would win the crown. It would be just another perfect moment in her perfect life. Little did anyone know, perfection was about to shatter like a mirror dropped on concrete. The reflection would never quite piece back together the same way, and someone's hands were going to get cut picking up the pieces. As Rebecca walked to her car that evening, a plan started forming in her mind. She wasn't proud of where her thoughts were taking her, but years of living in Sandra's shadow had created a darkness inside her that was starting to seep out. She glanced back at the gym, where Sandra was still practicing, her silhouette graceful against the gym's bright lights.